Um, Today we have Mr. Jack Belcher, who's going to give us a presentation on energy security and decarbonization, shifting priority in U.S. energy policy. I will allow Arnaldo Rodriguez to present Jack. Jack came to our knowledge thanks to Arnaldo Relations. Adelante, Arnaldo. No, estaba en mute.
All right. Thank you, Carlos. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce longtime friend, Jack Belcher. We worked together in Shell, Houston. I've known him for about 18 years or so. Jack Belcher serves as a principal at Cornerstone Government Affairs. It's a bipartisan professional consulting firm with a specialty in environmentally social governance, ESG, and sustainable planning. He also serves as the managing director of the National Ocean Policy Coalition and as the vice president of the Center for ESG Sustainability. He has over 30 years of experience in energy and energy policy. Jack provides strategic and tactical advice to energy and transportation companies and financial institutions, focusing on government relations, regulatory affairs, public policy, strategic communication, situational risk management, and ESG performance. He works with energy companies to help them with their strategies for decarbonization. Jack previously served as Executive Vice President of HBW Resources, Regulatory Affairs and Policy Manager for Shell North America's Exploration and Production Division, and Staff Director for the U.S. House of Representatives Subcommittee on Energy and Mineral Resources. Jack also previously worked for the Independent Petroleum Association of America, Hart Energy Publications, and Texaco Gas Marketing. Jack holds a BA in Government from the University of Texas at Austin. His Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, certified by the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, and certified by the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. Please welcome Jack Belcher today.
Thank you, Arnaldo, and thank you for inviting me to be here today, and thank you, Carlos, for the introduction. Good morning. It's great to be here talking to you all today. And as Arnaldo mentioned, I'm Jack Belcher with Cornerstone. I'm going to talk to you today about a lot of energy policy issues from a U.S. perspective, looking at things both from a U.S. perspective, a global perspective, and then narrowing things down to U.S.-Venezuela relations and what the future might hold. So next slide. So walking through our agenda, so I'm going to talk about what I call the energy trilemma, the forces that impact energy policy. We put out a U.S. energy matrix. I'm going to walk through that a bit to get some color on some of the issues that are most pressing, that evolve quarter to quarter. And then we're going to go through what's happened so far in the Biden administration, a little roadmap that kind of explains where we've been, where we're going, what is some of the legislative and regulatory action that's taken place, and then moving into what some of the game changers have been over the last few months. The war in Europe, the energy crises, how is that changing policy and impacting things? So the shifts in U.S. policy, some of the changes in the administration's rhetoric that have resulted from that, and then how the pathways have changed, what the priorities are now. Then I'm going to go into some of the global trends and how they impact overall energy policy, and then a reality check on sort of what the impact of the embargo and what's happening in global markets, and then finally moving into sort of U.S. Venezuela policy and looking into the future. And then I'd like to have a discussion with everybody. I look forward to questions on some of these topics and everybody's collective thoughts on where we may be going. So next slide. So a little bit about Cornerstone. We were founded in 2002, based in Washington, D.C., as largely a government affairs firm. But over time, we've evolved to bring in public affairs communications, advisory services, and then we opened a ESG practice about 3 years ago that I had out of Houston. I'm based in Houston, but we have offices around the country, 400 plus clients. They represent just about every industry across the economy. We have about over 120 employees and 14 offices. Our energy practices in Houston and our clients are across the energy value chain, upstream, downstream, midstream, renewables, a lot of companies that are energy users that are looking for advice on things like decarbonization. And we have a lot of experience now in advising on ESG sustainability programs and decarbonization. We'll move on to the next slide. So I'd like to talk about the energy trilemma. And this is what influences energy policy. Everybody, when it comes to energy, everybody wants three things, and to varying degrees. We want reliability, we want affordability, and we want sustainability. Reliability is things like access and being able to permit and have access to infrastructure. Affordability have to do with how affordable is energy, what are the fiscal terms, what is the regulatory intensity, and then obviously trade policy impacts all of this. And then a sustainability, which is increasingly important over the years, emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, how we're treating the environment, how we're protecting the habitat. These policies impact energy policy, or these different factors, reliability, affordability, and sustainability, are supported by energy policies, but they're not necessarily coordinated. They're often at odds at one another. So when efforts are made to make things more sustainable, they can affect reliability and they can affect affordability. And it goes really that way for all of these factors. Sometimes they work in tandem, sometimes they work against one another. And I think the real challenge in terms of energy policy is striking the right balance of all three of these things. So next slide. So every quarter, Cornerstone gets together with our clients and we put together a quarterly issues matrix. And this is a US focused matrix that prioritizes the top issues that are impacting the industry. And we put it in this matrix, which is a grid which bases things on likelihood of occurrence and potential impact. And you can see in the red section at the top right-hand corner, those are the issues that are the most burning. Those are the issues that have the highest likelihood of occurrence.
Carlos, sorry, please.
That have the highest likelihood of occurrence and the greatest potential impact. And as you can see, there are a lot of issues that fit in this column. Climate and regulatory policy are big. The price situation that we're dealing with is a huge issue. A lot of issues that are regulatory that have to do with access and fiscal terms and reliability. These all kind of are falling into that high category. ESG is more important on it every quarter. And then we've got this supply chain disruption that's impacting everything. Inflation, our ability to produce, impacting the entire globe. So move on to the next slide. So I'm going to go through, let's talk about what's happened so far in the Biden administration. Well, the Biden administration came in very focused on climate and environmental issues and making a lot of commitments, a lot of promises to really change things in terms of U.S. emphasis on climate. rejoining the Paris Accord. That was one of the first things out of the box that the administration did, and then started to go through and achieve certain things, mostly on the regulatory or administrative side, not the legislative side. So one of the examples is the climate disclosure rule, and that is a rule that's going to, it's a rulemaking that's underway right now that's going to require companies to report their Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions. And this is something that is being done. Congress has no real ability, realistically, to impact it. A lot of companies are in favor of this, especially the larger ones. A lot of the smaller ones think that it's too burdensome. And the ultimate rulemaking that probably comes out at the end of the year will probably give more leeway to those smaller companies and have stronger commitments to the larger companies. There's also a methane rule that has been an ongoing process for several years, going back and forth between administrations on how to put this methane rule out. We feel like it's in a near final phase right now, and what it will do is result in a 74% reduction in methane emissions by 2030. It's also in line with what happened in Glasgow at the COP26 climate summit in the last fall, and that is that over 100 companies, over 100 countries made a global methane pledge to reduce their emissions by 30%. So that's going to be a challenge ongoing, but in the US, this methane rule is very much tied to that. So it's methane reduction from oil and gas production. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission is a body in the US that regulates things like pipelines, regulates electricity transmission, regulates LNG export facilities. It has been going through a process where it's viewing everything through a climate lens. In other words, every decision that FERC made used to just be made in terms of the national interest based on energy needs. Now it's going to be looking at what the impacts of every project is in terms of a climate change impact. Now that is a process that they're going through. They tried to go through without a public comment process. They had to back off because there was a lot of resistance. They're now moving through a public comment period, and we expect something to come out on this by the end of the year. And then federal oil and gas, federal lands for oil and gas. The policies in the US under this administration have been very much against using federal lands for oil and gas development. And that means the offshore, where so much of the US production has been over the years, they've halted leasing. There have been some court battles over it. The administration has clearly decided that they don't want to fight in favor of more leasing. Every year, the US goes through a process to determine what leases are going to be made available offshore, and that process should have been well underway by now, but the administration is dragging its feet, and as of now, there's no 5-year plan process in place, and that's kind of frightening in terms of offshore oil and gas development, especially as you look to the future of US offshore oil and gas investment. They've also raised royalty rates and made it generally more difficult for oil and gas production, leasing, permitting on federal lands and the offshore. We'll go to the next slide. So in terms of legislation, there have been some major pieces of legislation that went through last year. One of them was the infrastructure bill. There was a lot of talk about this. It was passed into law late last year. It provides $550 billion over 5 years. It impacts things like climate resiliency, plugging orphan wells, things that deal with environmental things like water resources. It was considered the first step of 2 pieces of legislation that were going to really lay out the administration's domestic climate agenda. The second one was something that was going to be done through a process called budget reconciliation, and it was the Build Back Better bill, which was a bill that there was a lot of contention over, a lot of fighting over it. It was going to put in place a methane fee. It had originally held some punitive taxes for the oil and gas industry, but it also had a tax extension an expansion for a tax called the 45Q that was going to help with carbon capture and storage. That bill was defeated because two Democratic senators thought it was spending too much money at a time that inflation was on the rise. So it was ultimately defeated by the Senate and will not be going into place. That was considered a big defeat for the Biden administration. There's talk of a Build Back Better 2.0, a compromise that may involve a pre-election deal making that may include that 45 tax credit for carbon capture. We'll have to see if that happens. Right now, as much contention as there is in the Senate, as much fighting there is in the Senate, it's not looking that likely, but things could change. Senator Manchin from West Virginia is a real deal maker, and he'd like to get some of this stuff passed through. So, and then there's been talk of a bipartisan deal on carbon pricing and border adjustment taxes. We'll see where that goes. It's probably something that gets pushed onto the next Congress next year. But the bottom line is that the administration, when that Build Back Better bill failed, it took a big loss, and it took a lot of the wind out of the sails of the administration in terms of climate, its ability to enact climate policy through legislation. We'll go to the next slide. So about that time, we started having high commodity prices, getting higher and higher, higher inflation. And then as we moved into this year, well, first there was rumblings of war. Now we've got war in Europe. And obviously that's a big shock to the system and a big shock to the Biden administration and to all of the policymakers in terms of where we are. Prices and inflation were already high before the European situation happened, before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But now we're looking at super high inflation numbers and high gasoline and energy prices. This is all having a huge impact on the administration, which has a very low popularity right now. And the number one factor that voters are looking at are inflation and gasoline prices. By far the number one issue that voters are looking at. There's also the issue of needing to get energy to Europe. And so the administration had reversed its policy, which was lukewarm on LNG and certainly not in favor of new oil and gas production. Now they've made commitments, and the administration went over to Germany and made commitments that we're going to be bringing all this LNG to Europe to help alleviate the situation there. As you all know, prices for energy, electricity, and for natural gas and fuel have been super high, much higher in Europe than they have been in the United States, having a big impact on the economy. They're exacerbated by what's happened with the natural gas being shut off from Russia, from oil being shut off from Russia, from Europeans enacting an embargo on Russian energy. So all of a sudden, LNG becomes a topic that everybody wants to talk about. It's interesting to me as somebody who's worked in LNG and has had a couple of LNG, currently has LNG clients. Politicians never really, not many of them ever wanted to talk about LNG. Now everyone wants to talk about it. And that's happening by members who have been decidedly anti-fossil energy over their career. So it's been a bit of a shift. Fossil energy was sort of proclaimed to be dead in the United States at the beginning of this administration. Now you have politicians asking for more oil and gas production and more, and really focusing on being able to export it. So what's been missing though is an understanding that we need to support the entire supply chain, and that is everything from exploration, having new leases, running room for us to explore and then develop and produce energy, to have infrastructure that's able to take that energy to market, to be able to refine that or to export that. And so there's still a big disconnect in terms of supporting the entire value chain and really supporting all three legs that I talked about: reliability, affordability, sustainability. It's an interesting time. It's a rare opportunity to have so many members of Congress wanting to increase domestic supply, including fossil energy. The question is, given all the contention, will that window be large enough to take advantage of it? Next slide. So we have seen a recent change in rhetoric from the Biden administration. For instance, at FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, a couple of decisions have been made in the past few weeks that have been a bit of a reversal in policy, especially when it comes to pipeline approvals. The FERC has been moving in a direction of approving less pipelines, but there was the Mountain Valley pipeline, which takes natural gas out of the Marcellus in the Northeast to bring to market. That was approved recently by FERC after a lot of opposition to it. So that was an interesting signal that there may be a change in position. Also, approval for 2 requests by existing LNG producers to increase their capacity. Those went through, and that happened after months and months and months of not hearing anything out of FERC. We're also hearing politicians voice support for U.S. production, especially LNG. Climate envoy John Kerry, who's never been a friend to the fossil fuel energy, recently said that, quote, natural gas is going to be a key component in the energy transition. Energy Secretary Granholm has been really calling on producers, produce more oil and gas. We need oil and gas production to rise. And President Biden has recently said that the idea that we're not going to be using oil and gas or hydrogen is not a rational idea. His ally, Senator Coons in Delaware, from his home state of Delaware, has also put out a letter calling for support for LNG. So these are big, significant, I would say, significant at least, maybe temporary, but significant changes in rhetoric and somewhat changes in policy. And there's been a rise in this notion of a 2-track approach. What I mean by that is we had divergent policies where people were calling on more production based on energy security needs, and we had policies that were aimed at climate change, looking at decarbonization. And they seem to be at odds with one another until quite recently. During CERA Week earlier this year in Houston, there was a lot of talk about this, the need to have an approach that looks at energy security at the same time you're looking at decarbonization and climate goals and net zero goals. So that's a change in overall rhetoric that we're seeing. How long that's sustainable is another question, but it seems to be an opportunity. Next slide. So we are also seeing evidence of easing from the financial markets. There's been a trend you all are aware of, I know, over the past few years, that financing organizations led by institutional investors have been trying to pull money out of fossil energy. This has been happening with development banks globally. It's been happening a lot out of Europe, but it's also been happening a lot out of the US and everywhere in the world, really, that the institutions, the financial institutions, have been calling for less money to be invested in fossil energy. Well, we see some evidence that that's changing a bit. BlackRock, which has been a big leader in the decarbonization and ESG effort, has said that they're going to vote against more climate resolutions this year. Shareholder resolutions that have been coming up with increasing frequency, they're now going to be opposing them. And there's been greater access to capital over the last few months. As commodity prices have increased, so has the margins for profits in energy companies. That's attracting more capital. And then there have been some creative mechanisms that have been coming in place, like securitization of producing wells, creating special purpose vehicles that can be utilized to access capital. And so that's a trend that's quite interesting. We're seeing more creative financing, like some highly structured financing that's been coming into place, bringing more money to the market. And then the Carlyle Group announced a merger a few weeks ago of their energy and infrastructure units, which ultimately means more money going into fossil energy projects. So it's clear that money is returning to fossil energy. Is it enough? Is it happening fast enough? These are all questions that we really won't know until I think we're looking back in the future. Next slide. So what are some of the global trends? You know, one of them obviously is this proliferation of decarbonization. That's everything from money and efforts going into carbon capture and utilization and storage projects. We have in the US competition over hydrogen hubs. That's being funded through that infrastructure bill I mentioned earlier. A lot of companies are getting together with universities and states and other institutions competing for dollars for hydrogen hubs to start producing hydrogen. There is obviously an overall expansion in ESG and net zero commitments. If you look over the last couple of years, huge number of companies that have committed to net zero, but maybe they're not sure how they're going to get there. That's one of the things we talk with companies about every day is how do you get to your net zero commitment? We're also seeing an expansion of things like responsibly sourced gas, natural gas that is that it meets certain requirements in terms of environmental performance, sometimes social and governance performance. That is growing, and part of that's being led by Europe. As Europe looks to U.S. natural gas, it's requiring certain commitments in terms of the environmental performance and maybe the ESG performance of that natural gas. We've got the SEC disclosure that I talked about earlier, and then global offset markets and how that is growing. That's a huge issue. A lot still to be determined on how that all works. We've got decarbonization and global trade married up with one another. Europe is putting through this carbon border adjustment tax, which is going to impact everything in terms of future products going into Europe. And then we have potential carbon border attacks in the United States. And then we've got this boycott that's going on in Russia. So a lot of things that are happening that involving trade. I mentioned ESG growth. And then we've got this changing geopolitical landscape that's, that is happening with Russia. Russia really, that can't really go back to where it was. U.S. energy is needed globally. We've got Europe lobbying the United States. We've got U.S.-China relations and a lot of questions around where China and India are going to go on decarbonization, and then the U.S. relations with oil-producing countries. Biden recently announcing he's going to Saudi Arabia, for instance. Next slide. So what is happening, okay, in reality, when we look at how all these things are impacting global markets? Well, it's important to note that the EU-Russia oil embargo is an agreement in principle, and that it isn't going to happen tomorrow. It's going to be phased out over through the end of the year, and then it's only going to be 90%. But it's hard to replace that Russian crude. We're talking about medium sour grade crude, and we think that prices are really going to be strongly impacted by this. So far, the oil embargo really doesn't seem to be hurting Russia. It's actually hurting Europe and other consuming countries. And an official I spoke to recently said that Putin is selling less oil at a higher price and making more money doing it. And that a lot of that's going to China and India. OPEC doesn't appear to be able to meet its current quotas, although Saudi Arabia has recently announced it's going to be boosting production, and that'll make somewhat of a difference. And U.S. production and exports are increasing, but not quickly enough to meet demand. There's a lot of pressure on refineries, U.S. refineries that are a high utilization rate, and globally, the refining capacity has fallen by 2 million barrels, in the U.S. by 1 million barrels over the last couple of years, creating a big structural deficit in refining. Next slide. So now we have the U.S. government going out there seeking additional supply globally. The Biden administration is in the beginning wanted to to differentiate itself on foreign policy. Now it's less condemning of oil-producing nations. It's seeking new sources of crude oil. So it already wanted a nuclear deal with Iran. Now it's really would like to see Iranian crude oil on the market, though it says there's no linkage. Clearly, it's looking to make a deal to bring more Iranian oil. Venezuela, the administration wants improved relations. It wants the negotiations in Mexico City to succeed. And ultimately, it wants to improve relations, looking at opportunities to bring Venezuelan oil onto the market. And then Saudi Arabia, the administration started out condemning the Crown Prince, but now he's asking for more oil in the market. And as he just said, he's going to be headed over to Saudi Arabia to talk about things like that very soon. Next slide. So what does this mean in terms of U.S. and Venezuela relations? Well, you all know that the Treasury Department renewed its license for Chevron to operate in Venezuela. That's going to extend through November. That's under existing terms. It's really looked at as creating more latitude for Chevron to explore business opportunities, to explore the overall environment in Venezuela. It's more or less a test. It also authorizes the service companies to maintain their assets, and we know the service companies are looking at potential future opportunities in things ramping up in Venezuela. As I mentioned earlier, there's pressure on the Mexico City negotiations to work. The administration is trying to apply that. Interestingly enough, and unless something changed in the last few hours, the Summit of the Americas that's supposed to be in Los Angeles, or that's taking place in Los Angeles next week, Mexico's president has said he won't attend without Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. So this is a big test, I think, for the administration. It could be kind of an embarrassment, very much an embarrassment for the Biden administration if those nations are, especially Mexico, is not taking part in it. So there are a lot of political forces on Biden, pressure for new sources of oil. There's a lot of opposition to making a deal with Venezuela. Republicans are very much voicing their opposition to it. Senator Menendez, a Democrat from New Jersey, has stated his opposition. And in Florida, a lot of Venezuelans and Cuban expats have been stating their opposition. Obviously, Florida is a very important state politically. Biden needs a political win. He needs an economic win and a foreign policy win. He really needs wins. So the question is whether an opening with Venezuela, a change in policy, if that could be a win. Then there's the question of how quickly would it make a difference. It would take years to make an enormous impact. You've got the issue of the talent drain out of the country, and then current production. What I've seen of that current production, 700 to 800, could potentially maybe result in 400, somewhere around 400,000 coming to the U.S. It may be higher. I'm anxious to hear what you all think. So next slide. So in conclusion, U.S. policies are shifting, and that's happening because of these pressures that have to do with inflation, that have to do with the high energy prices and the impact they're having on the U.S. economy and our relations globally. But there are boundaries about those shifts, political boundaries, and political actions, considerations could still impact them further. The big driver are obviously geopolitics, the economy, and inflation. Climate action and energy security are for now being pursued together. We'll see where that goes. And U.S. foreign policy is changing due to the need to bring more oil on the market. There seems to be an openness to support regimes that the Biden administration and past administrations have opposed in the past, and it could change U.S. policy further towards Venezuela. There are a lot of ifs in that, but I'm anxious to hear what you all think. It's going to be an interesting few months ahead. So with that, I want to thank you all and look forward to questions.
Thank you very much. Very good.
Thank you, Jack. Let me get back here. Yes. Okay. Thank you, Jack, for your very concise, interesting presentation. There's some questions in the chat. Let me start with the first one. It says, Mr. Bercher, as you know, USA hydrocarbon inventory is an important factor in determining the WTI crude oil prices, as well as the products. We also know for decades that Cushing, half an hour away from Tulsa, is the largest hub in the world for this inventory. And also, this area has been, after the Twin Tower situation, Cushing was on third high priority. And the question is, give me a second, there is a lot coming here. Is the U.S. government now somehow responsible for the security of Cushing, that you know?
Is the U.S. government now responsible for the security of
Cushing?
Cushing? I would say that when you say the security of Cushing, I would say that at the highest levels of the U.S. government, there's probably not as much awareness as there ought to be. That's one of the issues that we're facing, is that when it comes to our energy policy, there's been a disconnect between energy and national security for some time now. And there was a big shift in this administration early on. There's a huge void when it comes to officials that understand the impacts of energy, oil and gas, to national security, to global economy, to the U.S. economy. And that's a real danger, I think, is that there's not enough understanding. They're working right now, and they've been hiring folks to bring in that have been from past administrations to really be able to advise on this. But ultimately, I think it impacts a lot of the policies that are in place that should be more focused on energy security, more focused on assets, more focused on economic security.
Okay. The other question is, do you think the Energy Department would be willing to reactivate the contract with Venezuela once democracy is back and extend it to the other South American countries with over a century of oil production history to accelerate the development under the peaks of the transition, and the U.S. have access to these resources? The question related to the U.S. South American country treatment.
I think that that's being looked at with increasing interest. I think that what we've got coming up this week with the issues that are impacting the Summit of the Americas are not helpful to that effort. And past Department of Energy efforts have brought together the energy ministers in the hemisphere, and I think that there have been some good models of success along those lines. It doesn't seem to be a priority yet. One of my concerns is that everyone's chasing in the administration the crisis at hand that they see, and they're not looking at the broader long-term, how do you fix things in a longer-term situation. And obviously, we should be looking at more hemispheric energy cooperation. Now, again, I think there have been some folks that have been brought in to the administration that are looking at this that could be more helpful. And I also think that a lot of energy companies are both producers and service companies see the benefit of this, because they're in a situation where they have to sort of guess where they're going to be able to operate, where they're going to be, where there's, and I think there's going to be a lot of pressure from the energy community to try to create more certainty globally and within, the Americas. So I think not a lot's happening yet, but I think that it should. And I'm hopeful that they're moving in that direction.
Okay, thank you. The other question is there any study about the actual impact of these transition plans on energy policy on the average American in a time where we are facing the aftermath of the pandemic and the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, I think that it's interesting because when I think about the pandemic's impact, I think of it in two ways. One, there was the impact to production, right, which was based on demand destruction and happening in a very quick period, and obviously that had a huge impact. But it's interesting to see the recovery that's taken place from the production side. It's taken a while for the capital to catch up, and obviously companies that have been producing and had to stop producing and have seen erosion of capital available are somewhat they're not really keen to ramp up production quickly because they don't want to end up in a situation where they're in oversupply, where in a couple of years down the road they've made investments and all of a sudden you've got anti-fossil sentiment and they're being impacted again. There's still a lot of concern about pandemics and what they've done on the demand side of things. I still don't think we know, kind of looking at China recovering, for instance, some of these areas in the world that are still seemingly coming out of all this, how it's going to impact demand. And then you've got the geopolitical side of this, where, on the embargo, the Russian oil situation, but where's China going to be long term in terms of where it wants to receive its supply? So I think there are a lot of things around the pandemic that are, and going back to U.S. policy, I don't think that they're being looked at holistically enough, but clearly there are impacts from the pandemic that are ongoing. We've recovered somewhat from some of them. There are others that we still don't really know what the longer term implications are.
There is a second part of this question. It said the average Americans are the sponsors of government at the federal and state level. The way I understand the question is, what an increase in taxes will mean on this sponsorship in this hard time?
Okay, I didn't quite understand. Can you repeat it again?
It's the person said the average American is the sponsor of, the vote for the government and the federal and state level officials. Okay.
Yeah.
What an increase in taxes? They've been talking about increased taxes on windfall profit of oil, etc., will mean for these elections in a hard time.
Sure. I think there isn't going to be a windfall profits tax. There's just not enough. I mentioned Senator Manchin earlier. You'll have all the Republicans against it, and Senator Manchin will oppose it from West Virginia. I believe, I think you'll probably have 4 or 5 other Democrats that will oppose it. So the Senate will not be able to pass a windfall profits tax. But overall, I think there is a belief that the administration, the Biden administration, has taken a stance against the domestic oil and gas business that has contributed to the situation we're in right now. You can debate about whether or not that's true, but there's definitely a sentiment, a belief that they're connected, and Republicans are taking full advantage of that. How do I think this is going to impact the elections? I think we're looking at potentially an unprecedented sweep by Republicans in November. I think if you look at all the polls, the statistics about how voters are feeling, you go through different groups of voters that have traditionally been supportive of Democrats, their support has gotten very weak. And you look at certain states, definitely I feel like the House of Representatives is going to definitely shift over, probably in big numbers, to Republicans. And I see it probably happening in the Senate too, although it's less certain in the Senate. So is energy policy a big part of it? Yes. I think the two biggest factors are the inflationary figures overall and the way they're impacting people's ability to pay for their budgets, their ability to buy things and manage their own budgets. And I think a big part of it is fuel prices that are impacting everybody. I think people view that as something that enough effort has not been made by the administration to address, and maybe even been a cause of all of that.
Okay, another question right here. How soon does it take for the change in rhetoric from legislative players to become a present demand from both?
To become a
How will environmental NGO will react to these trends?
Yeah. Well, we're always going to have that play, right? I mean, those are those three things, right, that I mentioned earlier. They're always going to work against one another. The change in rhetoric is an interesting opportunity if it really means a commitment to decarbonization at the same time we're dealing with energy security, and we have policies in place that are able to not just deal with energy security but economic security to bring prices down. I don't see that happening very fast. I mean, Jeff, when you look at it, what is the likelihood that you could do something that really makes an impact in a shorter period of time? Where do the NGOs play in all of this? Well, I mean, the NGOs are pretty broad, right? You've got some NGOs that are going to always be against fossil, no matter what, and anything that is put in place, any compromise that put in place that preserves fossil energy moving forward, they're going to be opposed. Then there are other NGOs, and I work with some of these that are more measured. What they're looking for is the policy, both in the U.S. and global, to be on a pathway to where we're decarbonizing, we're lowering the carbon index and carbon emissions of oil and gas and other forms of energy production, and that we're making measured progress and we're moving in a direction that isn't going to upset the economy, that isn't going to make voters turn against efforts to address the climate issues and to address our environmental issues. We see in the U.S. and we see it globally, this back and forth between forces, supportive of environmental climate initiatives versus those that are supportive of energy production and keeping prices low. It's going to be interesting to see what happens in a lot of countries. It's going to be interesting to see what happens in Europe, for instance, as they go through sustained periods of high prices, and you look at what they've done in terms of reducing the amount of fossil energy production, the base load generation, right? Having to move electrons from the east into the west when the system is not, when the wind is not blowing and the sun is not shining, and they're not able to keep up with demand, and they've been shuttering the nuclear. There's a lot of factors at play. So that's a long answer to the question, but it's complicated. I think that in terms of with the NGOs, some are going to be trying to work the middle, some are always going to be out there on the fringes, and both are going to have their impacts. Hopefully we'll be able to have a middle ground policy that enables us to do both.
Okay, there's another question also related. For how long, in your opinion, for how long this embargo measure may have an impact on Russia?
Yeah, I mean, I think that ultimately it's going to have an impact on Russia, but it's really kind of in combination of a lot of other things. I think Russia's oil is going to find itself to markets, right? Especially when the world needs the oil. So it's impactful as you transition over. But as I said earlier, right now what we're seeing is that because commodity prices are high, they're getting that much more for a barrel, that it's overall really, some people say they're bringing in as much, some people say they're bringing in less revenue. I'm not sure whether there's going to be a period where they're hurt by enough in a transition before they've settled on new markets. I don't think we go back to where we were before. Europe's making some pretty big commitments, stepping out on a limb here. I think it's hard to go back. These things take years, if not decades, to recorrect. it's, I think, a number of factors, though, that are impactful to Russia. Just the amount of investment that's left the country, the number of offices that have had to close, and Russia's a country that needs outside resources, both capital and talent resources, technology resources, in order to grow itself, its economy. And so I think those things are really going to have a big impact on Russia over time.
Okay, thank you. How likely is the Biden organization and the rest of the world going to endorse the redeployment of investment in the fossil fuel industry and redefine the strategy to winning from fossil fuels?
Yeah, that is a $1,000,000 question, right? I mean, because we don't know right now. It's making a transition, and it's doing so. And how big of that transition? I think it's a reactionary transition, right? It's not a long-term commitment, and I think there's a disconnect. These are big capital projects, big capital investments. They take years of planning. They take years of structuring investments. They take years of permitting. There's a lot that goes into it, and I feel like sometimes politicians think you can push a button and change everything, and it doesn't work that way. The question is interesting because, I mean, the question is even hasn't made that commitment. It's made a commitment to try to temporarily address a problem that's tough politically. I don't think a really holistic effort's been made to do anything that's impactful long term. Not yet. That may happen. The question is, can they pivot to a place where they're looking at things in a less reactionary way and looking at things in a more measured, holistic way? Just like we talked about the opportunity for there to be a hemispheric energy effort, which I think is a great idea. They haven't gotten there yet. They haven't certainly gotten there in terms of how to finance future fossil projects, how to reverse the barriers that have been put up to finance. And remember the amount of finance that needs to go into decarbonization. If we're going to meet the goals that the administration and the world has set towards decarbonization, that's trillions of dollars of investment in new technologies, some that haven't even been developed yet. It's really hard to imagine putting your money into one set of things that are futuristic and not supporting what's existing. I think that's where a big disconnect is, and I think that can be very harmful.
Do you have any comment on the state awareness of the U.S. government regarding the risk involved in the lasting expansion in Latin America, and especially regarding the Chinese strategy of economic penetration in the region?
I had a hard time hearing that, so if you don't mind, maybe just a little louder, a little slower.
Can you hear me well?
Now better, yes.
Okay. Any comment on the state of awareness of the U.S. government regarding the risk involved in the lasting expansion in Latin America, and especially regarding the Chinese strategy of economic penetration in this region?
Yes. Now, there's awareness. I think across the board there's awareness. To what degree is there alarm? I think that varies from politician to politician. I think that varies from political party to political party. I think there's much more of a concern and awareness in more conservative sectors about A, the leftist policies, and B, the Chinese influence in Latin America. There is increasing, even on the left, awareness about the overall situation, the overall geopolitical shift, and the potential impact to Chinese-U.S. relations. I think that the supply chain situation has created a lot of red flags about the impact that China has on global goods and services. I don't think Americans see enough of what the Belt and Road policy by China is in terms of how it's impacting our competitiveness in places like Latin America. And you know, there needs to be more awareness made about it. A lot of politicians are involved, they're just less heard. So connecting those issues to sort of what our global strategy is, we'll see. I mean, I know it's kind of hard to imagine because it's been about a year and 4 months, but this administration is still kind of in its early stages. In some ways, it's kind of jumped right into a hornet's nest, a fire of sorts, and there are debates, a lot of debates going on within the administration about how to address China, how to address energy and climate at the same time. And the NGOs that you mentioned earlier, for instance, they play a big role in that environmental debate. And then with respect to China, it gets a little less clear because there have been a lot of Republicans that have been supportive of the U.S.-China policy for decades. And so at what point do they make a pivot, or to what degree do they make a pivot? And what is our ultimate policy towards China? It's evolving. I think there's not enough awareness, and it's a great question.
Okay, the horizon of oil and gas projects is 20 years. Do you think the returning investment to oil and gas industry will last enough to support the long-term energy projects?
I think that one of the results of this supply and commodity price crisis is that there's going to be, at some level, a rethinking and realization that we're not going to move to a non-fossil world quickly. And the pain that's being caused by high commodity prices, the impact geopolitically, all of those things are going to play into overall policy. Investment dollars are going to come in when investors see the ability to get a return on investment, and the things that impact that are commodity prices, stable markets, stable regulatory regime, right? Those are the things that are going to encourage investment. If what results from this situation right now is a belief that those things are going to be in place, and maybe the anti-fossil fuel policies reach their high watermark this year, and that they're going to be, at the very least, not going to advance any further. At the very most, maybe they're going to reverse themselves somewhat and maybe allow for more pipeline expansion, more oil and gas production on federal lands, U.S. policies that encourage energy development globally, U.S. policies that develop development bank money and global finance to be put into projects globally. I think those are things that could benefit from all of this. And so that's, I think that at least to some degree, there are going to be changes in policy that encourage those types of investments, at least bring them back from where they got.
Good. There is a couple of questions. Let me see if I can combine it. Well, let's say excellent presentation and approach to this complex issue. With the relaxation of climate change policy from the federal government, how will impact the commitment of a major oil company on reducing CO2 emission by 2050? And the other question is, what?
Okay, I need you to back up, Carlos. I'm sorry, I just missed a couple of words in there. So the commitment. Where was it?
I'll read it again. With the relaxation of climate change policies from the federal government, how will impact the commitment of the major oil company on reducing CO2 emission by 2050? And the second question is, what could happen to change the present view of fossil fuel even using CCUS? Will renewables support the energy demand?
I'll take the last one first. Renewables are evolving constantly, right? I mean, I have renewables clients that have amazing technologies, lots of promise. Okay, some of them are you can put into place now to do things like create energy for industrial projects. Some of them are dependent on advances moving forward. Most of them are dependent on critical minerals that need to be in abundant supply from places like China or from Africa, Kazakhstan, places where the Chinese are dominating things in terms of Belt and Road policy. So there are a lot of things that are that in the growth of renewables are dependent on. Technology, finance is currently there, minerals, resources, and so they're going to play a bigger role over time, but that's an incremental thing. That's not going to change things overnight. And I think we're all learning. I think Europe, as much as anybody's learned in the last few months, that depending on renewables to address your energy concerns at this time doesn't work. And so policies need to be more rational in terms of supporting renewable development, but doing it in a way that understands what some of the limits are, and that technology needs to be developed over time, and resources need to be accessed through geopolitical processes as well as investment. So the first piece had more to do with commitments to by energy companies to lower carbon. I think overall I used that phrase earlier. The energy companies are not going to reverse themselves and back off of these commitments. I do see companies make these commitments. It's not just in the oil and gas industry, it's manufacturing, it's all kinds of industries. They make these commitments and then they go, oh, whoa, how are we going to get there? I see that a lot. Then they start putting together decarbonization strategies that become more measured. We're going to do this now. We're going to address this low-hanging fruit. Then we're going to move to a different level, and we're going to invest in carbon capture and storage, and then maybe hydrogen will be part of our mix. Electrification, all these things that people are putting into place. There's too much investment and too much effort going into that, at least by the larger entities right now, to really back off of it. I don't see that happening. I do see some rationalizing of commitments, and companies, they're going to have to be buying credits in order to meet their commitments, because maybe they don't have the capability of putting in technologies and process changes that get them where they need to be.
Does the Biden administration understand that it is less harmful environmentally to produce the oil in the U.S. than in other parts of the world?
You know,
they mention a country, but I don't want to.
I like that question, because as somebody who is kind of lobbies, these people about this stuff, I mean, I've said it a lot, I've shown it a lot, whether they, and to some degree, I think people have to get it, but what impact does that even make? I mean, I think that's the question. It's when you're looking at all the political forces that are going into the things that are impacting decision making, it's one factor, and the question is, how important of a factor? How is it something that they want to embrace, or is it something they want to back away from? I don't know.
I'm going to use my privilege of moderator, and I'm going to ask you, related to that particular situation, I always had in my mind the question, why, when U.S. had to embargo the oil from Russia, didn't go to the oil shale instead they go to other countries?
Yeah.
I couldn't answer that in my mind.
It's a great question, and I think it has to do with this. One, I mentioned that there's a disconnect in terms of understanding the entire value chain, right? How it works. Two, I think that policies, when this administration started, were very much going to be opposing domestic oil and gas production. And there was momentum in that direction. There was rhetoric in that direction. There were regulatory actions in that direction. So that's all moving in one direction. And all of a sudden, we have this problem we have to fix. And there is still a disconnect in certain circles. Hey, look at what our shale capabilities are. That happened pretty fast. Why can't we go back to that? Nothing's really changed, right? And so I think it's just a predisposition by certain politicians to not want to go back there. And the question is, can that change? And how does that change? It's a great question.
You mentioned that as commodities and profits have been increasing in the oil and gas industry, apparently there have been some highly structured financing schemes with certain success with the financial community. The person asked if you have any particular example of the financing scheme.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have an example of a certain actual company that's doing this, but I can provide that, you know. But there have been some interesting articles recently about financing mechanisms, structured financing mechanisms that basically take existing producing assets, okay, and they create special purpose vehicles around those assets, and they sort of separate them from the other other risky or less profitable assets, and use that special purpose vehicle as a mechanism to attract and raise capital. And that's an increasing that is an increasingly used mechanism. I can't off my top of my head give you an example, but there've been several stories recently about companies that are using this kind of creative finance. And I'm happy to go back to some of those stories. I just can't recall who some of the banks or the financiers or the energy companies were that were utilizing them. They generally tend to be sort of the mid-size, not the majors or even the super large independents that are utilizing this. It's companies that are sort of in that mid-size independent oil and gas producer.
Do you envision a rearrangement toward a new East, Russia, China, West, U.S., America? Well, West, I don't know if they mean U.S. or European, America, energy commodity market due to the Ukraine invasion?
Hello, European Union.
European Union, America. Okay, I'll read the question again. Do you envision a rearrangement toward a new East, Russia, China, West, European Union, America, energy commodity market due to the Ukraine invasion?
Due to the
Ukraine invasion, the war in Russia, Ukraine.
I think there's a realignment taking place, and these are not easy, right? You can't just do something like that and immediately say, oh, we're going to align ourselves this way, because of all the commitments that are already made, right? And so just as Europe can say, well, we're getting off Russia oil, well, okay, where are you going to get the barrels that are of the same quality, same crude slate that you were getting from Russia? Can you actually do that in a short period of time? Well, no, you can't, right? You have to find substitutions. You have to come up with, or you have to reconfigure refineries. There are a lot of major investments. There are a lot of long-term contracts. There are a lot of supply chain issues. It's all very, very complicated. So making a big shift overnight causes a lot of pain, and it also has geopolitical implications that are very delicate. You know, we don't know what the long-term implications are of what just happened with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and European countries really moving strongly against Russia, looking at bringing Finland and Sweden into NATO. And then what does that mean in terms of the allies of the Soviet Union, some of which are like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Azerbaijan, that are big energy producing countries. So, you know, it takes a long time to realign, and I don't think usually the ultimate realignment isn't what you thought it was going to be in the first place, because There's so many complicated factors. The other thing that I think is crazy is when you think about all the investment that was made in Russia in and billions of dollars of investment over decades that have been made in Russia, and all of a sudden those assets are gone. Who gets them? What does that mean? What about all the writing that off on the balance sheet? How does that affect companies that are in existence? How does that impact their ability to raise capital? How does that impact their credit? There's a lot of things that are not understood, I think, that took place over the last few months that we're not going to really fully understand for a while.
Okay, thanks, Jack. Okay, I don't have any more questions in the chat. I had a couple of people that had to make a live question, and the first one is Mr. Pedro Figueroa. Estás en mute, Pedro. Estás en mute. Abre el micrófono. Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Mr. Bircher, thanks so much for your great technical presentation. I didn't see in your agenda, the word security. I personally visited Cushing for the first time in 2012.
Mm-hmm.
I was really surprised to see no security whatsoever. I went around with my private car, with my iPhone taking pictures, and nobody came to me, ask me what I was doing there. If the terrorists hit Cushing, more than half of the cities in the United States are going to be without power.
Yep.
And that is much worse than what Ukraine, by opening and closing a valve, is not going to supply gas to the Europe.
Yep.
So my question was, is the government doing something to improve that, or has already been doing something to improve that security?
No, and the short answer to the question is really no, not enough. It's a great, and I think that question was asked earlier. I think I misunderstood the question earlier, so thank you for bringing it up again. There's been a lot of effort that have gone into cybersecurity, right? After the attack on the Colonial Pipeline, and there've been some threats to pipelines and to refineries, infrastructure. And so there's been efforts made on the cybersecurity side, but the raw security around perimeters, the threats that could be made to facilities by terrorists, you look at the entire stretch of the Colonial Pipeline and some of our other major pipelines to ports. What about the Port of Houston, right? There's a little better security there, but still lacking at some of these facilities, and Cushing is a great example. Some of the facilities at Henry Hub are another great example. Yes, there's a big lack, there's a big disconnect. I feel like it's something that industry needs to take on, because I don't feel like the government prioritizes it enough, and the government seems to be very reactionary. And the industry has been reactionary too. We tend to fix our problems after something bad happens. We don't seem to be doing scenarios to look at things from a planning perspective and looking at where the vulnerabilities are. I think some congressional oversight could be helpful. Maybe some study, even an NPC study on the vulnerability of our energy grid, our energy complex. So it's a great point. There just really isn't enough going into that.
Mr. Belcher, the cybernetic attack, it hurt the pocket of the people. In this case, in Cushing, not only that, but it's not going to allow to the high production from the Permian Basin on LNG and supply other markets in the world, besides hurting the people in the United States. So that's what the reason my question. And then the second question, a similar thing, when I ask you that the Department of State, who handles the foreign policy for energy as well, the bureau that runs that part, as far as security, do they the first part of the question is, do we still have a contract, technological contract between the Department of Energy and Venezuela, which back in 2013 was the only one in place, and I tried to use it myself with my company in Venezuela. Do you know if it's still in place?
I actually don't. That's a good question. I'm in touch with folks at the State Department quite a bit, and it's something that I can follow up on, and I know the right person to ask with that question. So I will do that, and I'll make sure that you get we all get an answer to that.
Did you know the Bureau of Energy Resources, which advised
that's who I was going to go to. Yep, I know them well. Speak with them on a regular basis, and I will find that out.
Especially in case of Venezuela, if it's still active, that'd be great, because once the democracy gets back, we can probably get our feedbacks and produce again. I don't know how long it's going to take, but the other countries south of Venezuela, who have them for over 100 years, oil production, they might have shale gas. And the Department of State didn't do the analysis, the study for those countries, all the way from Colombia down to Chile. Well, Chile doesn't have production, but Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia too. And there's a source there that can be shale gas, and of course, with shale gas comes LNG, and that LNG can supply the world, including the United States, and help to develop the economy of these countries.
Okay, thank you, Pedro. Thank you, Jack. The next person, I think, Ender, you asked for a question?
Yes, I asked for the floor, Carlos. Mr. Belker, thank you very much for taking your time and sharing your thoughts with us. Thanks a lot. I just want to, before I ask the question, just want to share with you, I do care a lot about the environment. I've been an oil and gas person all my life. I installed solar panels on the roof of my house, and even though it is not a project with a big net positive present value, so however, I also understand that the transition from oil to renewable, less aggressive fuels to the environment has to be a transition done without impacting our economic system. And I personally feel that we need to create awareness across all parties here in the U.S., across all our politicians, that it is actually cleaner. It is less environmentally harmful to produce the oil here in the U.S. because we can control how it is produced than producing it somewhere else where we don't have any control and where we have countries that have no commitment to us at all. So I wish politicians would understand what the real situation is. If you go to Nigeria, they have been burning gas, billions and billions of standard cubic feet per day of gas for years. Venezuela is doing that now. 20 years ago, Venezuela had very stringent laws. And I can tell you when I was part of PDVSA, we were doing an excellent job controlling the flaring of gas. Russia, I'm sure, is flaring like crazy. Why do we insist in not producing here? However, we continue using the fuel because we need it, the oil. What are your thoughts? How do we create this awareness that fracking, the negative propaganda against fracking was a strategy from Russia that unfortunately Europe fell into that strategy, and we are also falling into such propaganda? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I've been asking it myself and banging my head against the wall at times about it. I mean, because we've been trying to present these messages. They fall on deaf ears when in normal times. I think we're in abnormal times right now, and it's the right time to really ramp that message up. I also think it's the responsibility of us to work with some of the reasonable NGOs in the world who bring some credibility and maybe say, all right, let's talk about an MCF produced here versus an MCF produced there, a barrel produced here versus a barrel produced there. What's the difference? And start measuring that. I think that what is measured is important. To be able to measure what is measured gets valued, right? And there should be a value associated with clean production. I think we're moving in that direction. I think some things are moving in that direction. I don't want to put it all off on that, because my goal is not to push things off into the future. But definitely that is a way that we move things. But there needs to be a blunt discussion about the real impact of what's produced in this country versus what's produced in other countries around the world. And it really, it's a response. It isn't just about promoting your own oil and gas. It's about creating a standard by which everyone sort of adheres to, right? I mean, ultimately, if that's a known thing, then it impacts certain markets and people will want to gravitate towards it. And it puts pressure on producers to clean up their act in other parts of the world. I think it does in the United States. I think producers in basins where somebody comes in and they certify their gas and they put in best practices and they let the world know that, well, that impacts the ones that don't. From a finance perspective, from a regulatory perspective, a license to operate perspective, all of those things are impactful.
Thank you, Mr. Jack. And we're paying a high price because politicians don't understand the difference between producing here and producing outside.
I agree.
Thank you, Elder. Arnaldo tiene la palabra y después Pedro lo está volviendo a pedir. Arnaldo, adelante.
So, Jack, again, thank you so much for an excellent context and presentation. I know I'm going to put you on the spot here, but how couldn't I, due to the audience characteristics? Given the trilemma you've mentioned in the offset, and say that you were given a special place at a table, hypothetically, obviously, how would you say to Venezuelan players to stop doing and to do more? Thank you.
Well, that's a tough one because of the situation Venezuela's in, right? I mean, that's really the predicament, right? So to qualify the question, if I'm talking to Venezuelans about what they're doing currently in terms of production, is that what you're asking, or are you asking what they do more broadly from a political perspective? I don't really want to get too much in the weeds on that.
So I would be interested, obviously, in the energy context. Yeah. If you feel welcome, feel welcome to go broad.
Yeah, no. I think that ultimately, obviously there are limitations on capital expenditures and just given the situation that Venezuela's been in. But what I would focus on is how to be competitive globally with what other countries are doing in terms of their commitments and in terms of best practices and performance. I think that it should be looked at not from oh gosh, we have to do this, that, or the other, but how do you set yourself up for the long term to be globally competitive, to attract future investment, to be able to deal with what everyone's going to have to deal with in the long term cost effectively, because the longer you hold back, the tougher it is to get there, right? And I think I always advise people, don't do everything at once. Take incremental steps. Address those things that are low-hanging fruit first. Make aspirations and then commitments toward just doing other things. Create a timeline. Don't try to do everything at once, because that's overwhelming, and it's not possible. It's not profitable. It's not good for anyone. It's about making measured, reasonable commitments, and putting policies, processes, and investments into place that accomplish that.
Thank you.
Thank you for that excellent answer. Pedro?
And this will be, I got a hard stop. I'm running a bit over, so if I probably want to wrap it up with this question here.
Mr. Bircher, I don't know if you're familiar with this, that 68% of the crude oil needed by USA and the Allies during the Second World War II, was supplied by Venezuela. And in spite of that, we still are not a developed country. In the 1990 decade, my company in Venezuela made 3 technical audits of the gas production in 100% of the fields from east to west. And I found out that we still, flare some gas purposely to produce the oil, but also somewhere just accidents, or somewhere because we were more convenient to, like it happened in North Dakota here.
Yep.
You had to do the same thing. And a decade before, I was trying to convince the industry to give more value to our product. Instead of burning gas, is to go to the petrochemical, which now has been talking, like Saudi Arabia and also in Venezuela, some good technicians talking about, give more value to the thing and try to get the people, developed economically by having more work and things like that. So what do you think of that?
I think it's a challenge for Venezuela, but I think it's a challenge around the world, right? I mean, you mentioned the Bakken, right? But we've had the same thing in the Permian. We've had the same thing in the Eagle Ford. Less in the Marcellus because it's a gas play. Everybody needs it's all about gas. So we have to start looking at things in terms of how do you incentivize eliminating flaring? How do you create more opportunities for gas to be utilized more locally in processes? There's a lot of technologies that have come into place. How do you incentivize that? And then you got to use both the carrot and the stick. I mean, you have to have restrictions, right? You have to have limits. You have to have policies that say, okay, enough is enough. We can't continue to do this, and figure out how the value is derived from not doing it, right? Because wasting is usually never a good idea, right? Despite outside of the environmental impacts, just being wasteful is not good. So, it's how do you create incentives? How do you come up with creative ways to utilize gas? How do you, whether it's electrification, whether it is figuring out how to get it to market, or use the gas itself more locally. But we're facing this problem in West Texas, and a lot of companies are moving out there to make cryptocurrency now, be using that natural gas to make cryptocurrency. I don't think that's I'm going to just reserve judgment on that. I mean, whether that's the best way to do it, but it is a way that's being utilized, and we'll see if ultimately that makes sense. But I think it's coming up with ways to incentivize and then ultimately to regulate.
Jack, one question. Do you have to leave? I mean, do you have enough more time, or you have to leave?
I actually have a commitment that I need to get to, but I can take one more.
Okay.
Excuse me, Carlos. Mr.
Don Pedro, just a second. I had a couple of questions. I'm going to issue to you right now. One, what option Europe have for gas supply disruption from Russia? One. And the second one, if you were the advisor to the government of the US, how will you address the issue of Venezuelan sanctions?
How would you address the issue of Venezuela what?
Sanctions. Venezuela sanctions on the energy sector.
So the first one with Europe, well, I mean, so it's a combination of things, right? It's supply of gas from the U.S. It's looking at North Africa, Algeria. There are opportunities to. The Europeans are going to have to invest in the production side, I think, a little bit on this too, or they're going to have to support the investment on the production side. There could be more volumes out of North Africa. Obviously, you've got a pipeline infrastructure that's coming from the Caspian, from Central Asia, and there's opportunities for gas to come in there. Obviously, Qatar and Middle Eastern suppliers. So I think Europe has to look at all of its options, right? And they've got to pay a little bit more for their gas to secure the volumes. Plus, they have to invest in the infrastructure on their side, right? And that's a couple of things. They have to invest in regasification, more regasification than they currently have. They have to invest in gas storage, because gas storage is woeful in Europe. Right now, it's not even a choice, right? They need every molecule they can get. But ultimately, they need to be looking at gas storage. So it's investing in infrastructure. And then I think that they need nuclear and some other options, too, that they were moving away from in order to meet their baseload generation. So that's you were talking about natural gas. And so I think that can they make it all up? I don't know. I think they need to look at their options, and they need to be investing in solutions that are not just about decarbonization, but that are about energy supply. And they've got their own shale. They need to look at that again. Both they've got their own hydrocarbon resources in Europe. They've got offshore in the Mediterranean. I don't know if they've got the political will for that, but they may need to take a look at that again.
What about Venezuelan sanctions?
Okay, Venezuela sanctions, that's a very tricky question. What would I advise the government to do on that? I would be careful to embark on a policy that that results in a political outcome that you don't want. I'm going to keep it that level, okay? I think that you have to be careful. You got to measure what you're doing. You got to look at the long-term consequences and say, if we do this, what is our leverage here? What is the ultimate outcome? If your policy is that you want democracy to exist throughout the hemisphere, that's what you're ultimately looking for, you need to be careful about what you do. And you need to make sure that your lifting of sanctions are aligned with certain political outcomes and behaviors.
Thank you, Jack. Well, thank you, Jack. Thank you a lot for your openness to talk to us today. We're really honored for your presentation and your participation. And you're invited to any of our webinars in the future.
Great.
So maybe you have to learn Spanish, because most of them are Spanish. But,
Right.
we're recording, and you can translate the recording.
Okay. Super. Well, look, this has been, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead.
This has been a great group, great questions. Wow. I think this is the most questions I've ever fielded in one of these before, I think by far. So this is great. Thank you for the opportunity, and look forward to staying in touch with you all, and good luck. There's all kinds of interesting things happening right now. We live in interesting times. So have a great weekend, and thanks again.
Yes, and we'll keep in touch, okay?
All right. Take care, everybody.